The Blue Jewel.
Chapter 7. Part 1. Chapter 7. The gods punished us, and then chaos ensued for us. To contain the accursed, a group of wizards risked their lives to recover the ancient grimoires. Thanks to them they were able to build the magic wall that isolated the city. The cost was high. The magicians who survived the ritual decided to create a magic order to preserve the knowledge of grimoires in times of need. Thus was the origin of the Great Order of the White Robes. White Robes. Fidorus Magnus. Vanus woke her up the next day with his usual whisper. Arian was quite tired from the previous day. The servants offered her a hearty breakfast from which she only took a little milk with honey and some fruit. He dressed in a loose light blue tunic, typical of the place, then put on simple fabric sandals that were very comfortable. With her hair tied back with a white silk ribbon, she decided to leave her room. It was early and a bit cool, but the temperature was pleasant. His room was next to a large terrace, from which he could see the entire royal palace. The sky was completely clear and the sun was shining brightly, so Arian could see clearly the countless gardens, the spectacular fountains and the various mansions that made up the royal palace. It could be summed up in the sum of many palaces within a wall. Arian was in the largest of them all, where the royal family resided and with a more spectacular construction, adorned with gold and immense precious stones. Around this palace were smaller palaces. From his vantage point, Arian could observe the other structures. Arian then noticed a small two-story mansion located on his left. It was where the mercenaries were staying. To his surprise, despite his turns during the previous night, it was right next to his room. "I just had to jump over the wall and I was in the other palace." The young woman laughed at herself. She was able to survive without problems in a wild forest, but she was a disaster to orient herself inside a dream palace. He was able to observe the palace in detail. It had a large interior courtyard with a beautiful garden, full of weapons and shields placed in great order, ready for combat. In the center there was a small fountain that had the statue of a seated dragon. The two half-orcs went out into the courtyard. Arian crouched like a thief, not wanting to be caught spying again. Arras and Agnoruk had met at dawn. They had many things in common but also too many differences. What they both agreed on was their obsession with sword training. Among the orcs the art of fencing was something inculcated from birth from father to son. It was a religion for them, so much so that they had created a myth, the Asura. When an orc reached such a degree of perfection in the art of fighting, he was given the title of Asura and was regarded as the living reincarnation of the goddess of war. It was a far greater privilege than being a king or head of a clan. But it had been millennia since anyone had been worthy of being named Asura, since the Wars of Exile. If among the orcs the art of fighting well was a religion, among the white orcs it was something taken to the limit. The last Asura named was a member of his tribe, and that was an honor they all had in their blood. They both had Sinafti blood. They both got up at dawn to practice, and one day it occurred to them that it wouldn't hurt in one morning to have a sword duel, without blood of course. As they did not want to publicize the duel, they decided that the best time would be the morning after the king's dinner of honor, when the rest of the mercenaries would sleep much more, as a result of the party. Both advanced barefoot, wearing only their mercenary pants, as the orcish tradition dictated. Their chests were totally uncovered. The two brandished wooden swords. Although both had steel longswords as their favorite weapon, Agnoruk had never been exquisite with his taste. Arras, however, usually wielded a sword of a higher quality, a personal gift from the emperor on the day he was promoted to general, custom made by the best blacksmiths of the Black Empire, blue steel purchased from the dwarfs of the dragon's dorsal. Perfectly balanced and a pommel decorated with a dragon's head, his two eyes were black amethysts, and carved on his head a legend in common orc that read, "The Black General." And I missed her now. The two warriors advanced to the middle of the courtyard, made a series of warm-up blows in the air. As we had agreed, in the best of two touches, The blow that must be fatal is marked for it to count as a point, understood? Arras spoke while he concentrated. You had to have a lot of self-control in this type of duels, despite the wooden swords. Letting yourself be carried away by the momentum could imply a mistake that could cost death or a very serious injury. Agnoruk nodded and stood on guard. Who taught you? Arras asked. My father and a blind dwarf, the rest went through combat. Arras smiled. He had learned from his father, other orc warriors and the best instructors of the Black Empire. He had had an impeccable training. However, Agnoruk, though rough in his movements, had something different from the rest. They began to spin around the courtyard. The morning had begun. They weren't alone. A petite, silver-grey figure came out onto the deck. It was Gosberg. He gave a big yawn before lighting a cigarette. The two opponents looked at Gosberg with some anger. The Denka scratched his ass in response. How did you hear about Gosberg? I find out everything that interests me. It's a simple workout, replied Arras, concentrating. You also need a referee to mark the touches. The two half-orcs looked at each other with some condescension. Gosberg wasn't going to leave, so they both agreed that the Denka would be the referee. Get started at once, shouted the Denka. The two rivals continued to spin around each other, studying each other, while Gosberg smoked long puffs. I want sword strikes now. It's not a fairy duel, Gosberg protested. Arian sat up a bit to watch the duel more comfortably, even if it made her reveal her position. Vanus joined her as a spectator. Gosberg's cry caught the attention of some other mercenary who was already awake. They went to the courtyard and the word began to spread between the barracks. In 2 minutes the courtyard was full of mercenaries. No one wanted to miss the duel.